The Regent's Reign, Chapter 12, Lure. 6 months had passed since everything had happened, and summer had finally arrived, and with it a bout of illness in the lower town. Gaius had his hands full, spending most nights in what had been Gwen's house. Since she now had permanent lodgings in the castle, she had given the house over to the physician's use as a hospital for those afflicted. The good news was that the malady was not magical, nor always fatal. Unfortunately, the care for this particular illness was intensive, meaning Merlin was taking over the majority of his usual duties. She'd long learned who needed what on a daily basis, but then a woman came from one of the outlying villages. There was a sickness there, and no one with the knowledge to care for it. From the description the woman gave, it was nothing Merlin and Gaius hadn't dealt with before, but Gaius could not be spared. "I can go," Merlin insisted. Arthur opened his mouth to argue. "I shouldn't be gone more than a week. Leon's been following me around enough to know what goes to who, and don't think I don't know that's at least partly your doing," she said, waving a finger at Arthur. Leon avoided eye contact with both of them. He had indeed taken it upon himself to watch Merlin's back more often. Arthur had noticed and encouraged it. The future queen should be defended, and he knew better than most that Merlin attracted trouble like a moth to a flame.
"You're not going alone,"
Arthur said, conceding ground. "You can't spare men at the moment," Merlin argued. They were light on knights at the moment. Few had passed Arthur's trial since the immortal army had gutted their ranks.
"You're not going alone."
Arthur stood firm on this. Merlin rolled her eyes. "I'll go," Gawain said, stepping forward. Was beginning to feel a bit cooped up here anyway. Arthur looked like he wanted to argue, but nodded.
"You'll leave at first light, then. Merlin, show Leon everything he needs to know."
Merlin nodded, and Leon followed her out. Arthur turned to Gawain.
"Keep her safe."
"Always, princess. She's practically my sister. I won't let anything happen to her," Gawain assured, and Arthur nodded. They set out in the early dawn hours on horseback, with the woman who had come to Camelot begging assistance leading the way. Her village was small. So small that it was not on any maps, but that wasn't unusual. Broken Creek, the inhabitants called it, for the creek that seemed to shatter next to it into the 3 smaller brooks, or at least that was what the woman had said. Merlin started to feel off about the situation when the woman led them off the trail 2 days' ride from Camelot. They had to dismount. The terrain here was too rough to easily ride through. Maybe that feel of unease was what had Merlin breaking random branches as she passed, really just snapping twigs, but it would be an easy trail to follow if it was needed. The woman paused, and they stopped with her. Merlin spotted it before Gawain did. The woman's hands were shaking. Glancing around, she spotted the archer in the tree before Gawain could and tackled him, the bolt meant for his heart sailing past their ears. They rolled, Gawain regaining his feet quickly. The woman was crying. "They have my children. I'm sorry," she cried as men rushed into the clearing. They were outnumbered 10-2. If it had been Lancelot, Leon, or Percival, with her maybe she would have had the courage to lash out with her magic. It wouldn't matter who saw if no witnesses were left. But she hesitated for a fraction of a second too long and felt a sting at the side of her neck. She reached up and pulled out the dart as dizziness took over. She saw Gawain fighting and heard the woman who'd led them here scream. She didn't feel herself fall as her world went dark. Gawain wasn't sure why they left him alive. Injured, sure, but then again, he had taken down 6 of the 10 men. The other 4 had snatched the 2 horses who hadn't fled, the woman who'd led them here, and Merlin. He'd seen her hit with a dart and known they'd always meant to take her alive. His distraction had led to an injured leg. Swearing, he leaned against the nearest tree. 2 days away from Camelot with no horse and no Merlin and no one expecting them back for another 5 days. He'd never been happier to see Merlin's horse wander back into the clearing. From his understanding, Ignis wasn't always the most reliable steed, bolting when frightened, but he did tend to show back up when he was needed most. Gawain tore his cloak and tied it tightly around his leg to slow the bleeding, and somehow managed to pull himself up onto the saddle without blacking out. Arthur was going to kill him. Arthur was going to have his carcass hung from the battlements when he learned they'd walked right into a trap. Gawain would even let him for this one, but first he needed to make sure Merlin would be found alive and whole.
Get me back to Camelot as fast as you can, and it'll be apples and carrots from me every time I see you,
Gawain assured. The horse huffed and took off at a gallop as though it understood him. He nearly screamed as the movement jarred his injured leg, but he grit his teeth and held on. "Sire," Lancelot called as he slammed the door to the council room open, making many of the people there jump. "Sir Lancelot, I hardly," one of the older council members began.
"Apologies for the interruption, my lords, but Sir Gawain has just returned."
Arthur perked up at Lancelot's words.
"Alone, injured, and unconscious."
All color drained from Arthur's face. He shot from the throne.
"Council is dismissed,"
he called, running out of the hall, Lancelot leading the way.
Gaius had just returned to the castle. He and Leon are with Gawain now, but Gaius says he's lost a lot of blood. It doesn't look good.
Lancelot said, and Arthur swore. They reached the physician's chambers and met Leon outside.
"Gaius says if Gawain makes it through the night, he'll live, but he lost a lot of blood. He's not regained consciousness either,"
Leon informed him.
"Was there any sign of Merlin?"
Arthur asked.
"Gawain was riding Ignis when he arrived. I know Merlin took him out, but other than that, no,"
Leon said, shaking his head.
"Gather the others. We ride within the hour. I will find Merlin."
Arthur said, and Lancelot nodded, taking off down the stairs towards the training field.